The desert wind whispered across the Arizona night, the kind of silence that makes the world feel forgotten. Outside a lonely cabin, a starving German shepherd stood with 2 dying puppies, her last strength keeping them alive. No one knew they were there. Inside that same silence, an ex-Navy SEAL came here to escape his past, not to be found. But when he opened the door and saw her eyes, everything changed. 3 fragile lives were waiting, and what he uncovered next felt less like chance, and more like a miracle. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. A cold desert wind slid across the cracked earth, carrying dust like whispers that refuse to die. The cabin stood alone against the endless Arizona horizon, its wooden walls faded by sun and time, its windows reflecting nothing but distance. The man who had chosen it looked like he belonged to a different kind of storm. He was in his late 30s, tall and powerfully built, shoulders squared not from pride, but from years of discipline. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, practical and unchanging, and a faint layer of stubble traced the sharp lines of his jaw. His eyes, steady, watchful, and quietly burdened, moved not with curiosity, but with calculation. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to read danger before it spoke. He had once been a Navy SEAL. Years of operations had carved silence into him more deeply than any scar could show. The doctors had called it PTSD. He called it noise, the constant echo of things that never truly ended. That was why he had come here, to a place so empty it might swallow even memory. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of dry wood and heat-stored dust. He moved slowly, methodically, checking each corner the way habit demanded, though there was no threat here, only absence. By nightfall, he had lit a small fire and sat beside it, staring into the flame not for warmth, but for steadiness. Fire, at least, followed rules. Sleep came in fragments. It always did. Sometime after midnight, the wind changed. At first he dismissed the sound. The desert was alive in ways most people never noticed. Sand shifting, wood settling, distant echoes carried for miles. But this sound didn't belong to the desert. It came again. Faint, uneven, breathing. He sat up instantly, every muscle tightening with the quiet precision of a man returning to watch duty. His hand moved without thought toward the flashlight resting beside him. The beam cut through the darkness as he stepped outside. The cold hit harder than expected. Desert nights had a way of stealing heat without warning. The sky stretched wide and indifferent above him, stars scattered like distant signals no one was answering. Then he saw her. A German shepherd stood at the edge of the dim light, her body thin to the point of fragility, ribs faintly visible beneath a black and tan coat dulled by dust and neglect. She looked to be around 5 years old, once strong, once trained perhaps, but now worn down by survival. Her ears were half raised, uncertain, and her amber eyes held something deeper than fear. Behind her, barely visible against the sand, were 2 small shapes, puppies, no more than a few weeks old. Their bodies trembled weakly, too still for comfort. The man didn't move closer, not immediately. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto one knee, the motion deliberate, controlled. He extended one hand, not reaching, not claiming, but offering. His palm faced upward, empty, patient. Easy. His voice was low, steady, shaped by years of speaking to working dogs in chaos where calm could mean survival. The mother dog watched him. Every instinct in her body measured distance, threat, possibility. She did not growl. She did not bark. She simply stood there, balancing on the thin line between fight and surrender. Then she stepped forward, not because she trusted him, because there was nothing else left. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her frame, the way her breathing came shallow and uneven. One of the puppies gave a faint, broken whimper. That decided everything. He moved carefully, lifting the smaller bodies first, wrapping them in the thick fabric of his jacket before reaching for the mother. She flinched at the contact, but did not resist. Her strength had already been spent somewhere far behind her. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered against the walls as he set them down near the warmth. The puppies barely stirred. The mother remained alert, even in collapse, her eyes tracking his every movement. He worked without speaking, heating water, tearing cloth, improvising care with the same quiet efficiency he had once used under far worse conditions. For a moment, the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by something fragile, something that could break if handled wrong. Then the wind shifted again. This time, it carried something else. He paused. The smell was faint, almost lost beneath the dryness of the desert air. But it didn't belong here. It was metallic, bitter, artificial. His gaze moved slowly toward the door. The mother dog's ears twitched. Her body stiffened despite exhaustion, a low tension returning to her frame as if memory had just brushed against her instincts. The man stood, stepping toward the window without turning his back fully. Far in the distance, beyond the stretch of open desert, a light flickered. Headlights, too steady to be passing, too still to be coincidence. The engine sound didn't reach him. Not yet, but the light remained, watching. For a long second, nothing moved. Not the man, not the dog, not even the wind. Then, slowly, the light dimmed, not turning away, lowering, as if whoever held it had just realized. They were not alone. Morning in the desert did not arrive gently. It rose like a verdict, harsh and unyielding, spilling heat across the land, as if to remind every living thing that survival here was never guaranteed. The man was already awake before the sun fully cleared the horizon. He had not slept much. He rarely did. Instead, he had sat through the night beside the fire, watching the slow, uneven breathing of the 3 lives he had brought inside, as if vigilance alone could hold them together. In the pale light, the cabin revealed its new reality. The mother dog lay near the hearth, her body still tense even in exhaustion, her amber eyes opening the moment he shifted his weight. She did not trust him. Not yet. But she no longer saw him as immediate danger. That, in her world, was the first fragile step toward something else. The puppies were worse. Smaller than they should have been, their bodies weak, movements uncoordinated, as if the desert had tried to claim them before they had a chance to understand what life meant. One of them, darker in color, let out a soft whine as it struggled to lift its head. The other barely moved at all, its breathing shallow, almost too quiet to notice, unless one knew how to listen. The man crouched beside them, his movements slow, deliberate, never abrupt. He had learned long ago that speed frightened the wounded more than it helped them. He poured a small amount of water into a metal lid, letting it sit within reach instead of forcing it closer. Then he spoke, not because the dogs needed words, but because silence, to him, had always been heavier than sound. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice steady but low, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Over the next few hours, a rhythm began to form. It was not peace, not yet, but something close to it. He warmed broth, fed them in small amounts, adjusted the fire, and kept his distance just enough to let the mother choose when to close it. By midday, he gave her a name. Ash. It came to him without thought, maybe because she looked like something that had survived a fire no one else had seen. The darker puppy, the one that showed a flicker of stubbornness despite weakness, he called Dust. The quieter one, fragile but still breathing against the odds, he named Nova. Names mattered. They always had. In war, names were the difference between numbers and people. Here, they were the difference between survival and being forgotten. Ash watched him carefully as the names settled into the air. There was no understanding in the human sense, but there was recognition of tone, of intent, of the strange steadiness this man carried. The heat intensified as the day stretched on. Outside, the desert shimmered, waves of air distorting the horizon into something almost unreal. The man stepped out briefly to check the perimeter, his instincts still unwilling to rest after the light he had seen the night before. No vehicles, no movement, but something lingered. When he returned inside, Ash had shifted position slightly. That alone caught his attention. Animals did not move without reason. He crouched again, slower this time, closer than before. It was then he saw it. The scar. It circled her hind leg in a perfect band, just above the joint. Not jagged, not irregular, clean, deliberate. His expression did not change outwardly, but something sharpened behind his eyes. He reached out, stopping just short of touching it, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. Her ears lowered slightly, not in aggression, but in memory. He had seen marks like that before, not on animals, on equipment, on restraints. "Someone kept you," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Too tight." Ash exhaled slowly, her body lowering just a fraction, as if the truth had weight. The man leaned back, his mind already moving ahead of the moment. He stood, walked to the doorway, and looked out again toward the endless stretch of sand and rock. That smell from the night before. It returned faintly, carried now by the rising heat, metallic, bitter, wrong. He stepped farther out this time, boots pressing into dry earth that gave way with a soft crunch. His gaze dropped, scanning automatically. Tracks. At first glance, they were nothing. The desert erased evidence quickly, but not completely. Heavy tire impressions, partially filled by wind-blown sand, cut across the ground at an unnatural angle. Not the narrow tracks of a local pickup. These were wider, deeper, industrial. He followed them slowly, each step measured, his body instinctively lowering its profile without conscious thought. The tracks led away from the cabin, toward a stretch of land where the terrain shifted from open sand to scattered rock formations, a place easy to overlook, easy to hide things in. The smell grew stronger. He stopped. Kneeling, he brushed aside a thin layer of sand with his fingers. Beneath it, the ground was darker, slightly damp, not from water. He brought his hand closer, just enough to confirm what his instincts already told him. Chemical. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Behind him a sound broke the stillness. Soft. Quick. He turned sharply. Ash stood a short distance away, her posture different now. Not weak, not uncertain. Alert. Focused. She had followed him. Her nose moved through the air, then toward the ground, tracing something he could not yet see. When she looked up at him again, there was no hesitation in her gaze. She turned and began to walk, not wandering, leading. The man remained still for a second, watching her move ahead with quiet purpose. Then, without a word, he followed. Because in that moment, something inside him shifted, subtle but undeniable. He was no longer just surviving the desert. He was beginning to listen to it. And the desert was starting to answer. By late afternoon, the desert heat had begun to loosen its grip, but the air still held a tension that felt less like weather and more like warning. The man followed several steps behind Ash, careful not to crowd her, yet close enough to read the subtle language of her movement. She no longer walked like a creature simply surviving. There was direction now, memory guiding instinct. Her body remained lean, her ribs still faintly visible beneath her coat, but her posture had changed, head slightly lowered, ears angled forward, each step placed with quiet certainty. This was not wandering. This was returning. The terrain shifted as they moved farther from the cabin. The open sand gave way to clusters of jagged rock formations, their surfaces darkened by time and heat, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the ground. The kind of place a person could pass by 100 times and never notice what hid within it. Ash slowed as they approached a narrow break between two large stones. She paused there, her body stiffening, her nose lifting into the air. A low sound formed in her chest, not quite a growl, but not silence either. Recognition, uneasy, but certain. The man stopped just behind her. His breathing slowed, his posture lowering instinctively, the habits of a lifetime slipping back into place without effort. He moved one hand slightly outward, palm angled down, a silent signal, though she needed none. "I see it," he whispered. Beyond the rocks, partially obscured by the natural formation, stood a structure that did not belong to the desert. A long rectangular warehouse made of corrugated metal, its surface dulled by dust, but not abandoned. The edges were too sharp, too maintained. Its presence pressed against the landscape like something forced into place rather than grown from it. No road marked its approach, no sign announced its purpose. And yet, the ground around it told a different story. Tire tracks, many of them, overlapping, recent. The man crouched behind a low ridge, pulling a compact camera from the pocket of his worn jacket. It was not new, but it was reliable. He adjusted the lens with steady fingers, his movements precise, economical. There was no hesitation in him now. Only focus. Ash lay low beside him, her body pressed into the ground, her eyes fixed on the building. Her breathing had changed again, slower, controlled. Waiting. Through a narrow gap along the side of the structure, faint light spilled outward. Artificial, harsh. It cut through the soft amber tones of the desert evening like a wound. He shifted slightly, angling the camera. Inside, shapes emerged. Rows of metal barrels stacked in uneven lines, some marked with faded hazard symbols. Others bore labels half peeled by heat and time. The floor beneath them was stained, dark patches spreading outward like something that had seeped into the earth and refused to leave. His jaw tightened. There was no doubt now. He adjusted the focus again, capturing images in quick succession. Barrel markings, layout, entry points, details that would matter later, even if he did not yet know how. Then his gaze moved farther inward. Along one wall, partially hidden in shadow, hung several lengths of chain. Rust had begun to creep along their surface, but not enough to erase their purpose. They were fixed at a height too deliberate to be random, too evenly spaced. Ash's body tensed. A sound escaped her then, low, deep, and unmistakable. Not fear. Memory. The man lowered the camera slightly, glancing at her. For a brief moment, the distance between soldier and animal disappeared. What remained was something simpler. Two beings who understood what it meant to have been held somewhere against their will. "They kept you here," he said quietly. Ash did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the chains. Movement inside the warehouse broke the stillness. A sharp scrape echoed against metal, followed by the muffled thud of something heavy being shifted. Voices followed. Male, indistinct at first, then clearer as one of them stepped closer to the opening. The man froze. He lowered himself further, every line of his body dissolving into the terrain. The camera remained steady in his hands, but his breathing slowed to near stillness. A figure appeared briefly in the gap. A man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with a thick neck and heavy arms built from labor rather than training. His hair was shaved close to the scalp, and a rough beard covered his jaw, uneven and unkempt. He wore a faded work jacket stained along the sleeves. his movements careless in a way that suggested confidence without discipline. The kind of man who relied on routine more than awareness. He carried a flashlight loosely, its beam sweeping across the ground without urgency. "Thought I heard something," the man muttered, his voice rough, edged with irritation more than concern. Another voice answered from deeper inside, sharper, impatient. "Wind. Get back to it." The first man lingered a second longer, then turned, stepping back into the warehouse. The man beside Ash did not move. Not yet. Seconds passed, then more. Only when the sounds inside settled again did he begin to shift, inch by inch, pulling himself backward along the ridge. Ash mirrored him perfectly, her movements silent, controlled, her body staying low to the ground. They retreated without a word, without a sound, until the structure disappeared once more behind stone and shadow. Only then did he rise. They moved quickly now, not running, but not lingering. The distance between them and the cabin felt longer than before, stretched by the knowledge they now carried. By the time the cabin came into view, the sky had darkened into deep indigo. The first stars began to return, distant and indifferent. Inside, the air still held the faint warmth of the day. Dust and Nova lay where he had left them, their small bodies curled together, their breathing steadier now. Alive. Ash paused at the doorway before entering, her gaze lingering behind them, toward the unseen warehouse. Then she stepped inside. The man closed the door, sliding the lock into place with quiet finality. He set the camera down on the table, his eyes lingering on it for a moment. Evidence. It was never simple. He moved to the window, standing just to the side of it, not directly in view. Outside, the desert stretched empty, silent. Then, a crack split the night. Wood splintered beside him as something struck the wall just inches from the window frame. Sharp, violent, precise. Gunfire. Ash reacted instantly, her body launching forward, placing herself between him and the door, her stance wide, protective despite her weakened state. A low warning growl filled the room, deeper than anything she had allowed before. The man did not flinch. He simply stepped closer to the wall, his hand resting near the table, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. No second shot came. Only silence. Heavy, deliberate. He glanced once at the mark in the wood. The angle, the placement, not meant to kill, meant to warn. Ash remained standing, unmoving, her body a barrier. And for the first time since he had arrived in the desert, the man understood something with absolute clarity. This place had never been empty. He had simply arrived late enough to notice. The desert morning arrived quieter than the night before, as if the land itself had decided to hold its breath after what had been revealed. The man stood outside the cabin, the first light of dawn stretching across the horizon in pale gold. The bullet mark in the wooden wall behind him remained, a small clean wound in the structure, but a loud message in everything else. He traced it once with his eyes, then turned away. There was no fear in him. Not anymore. Only direction. Inside, Ash rested near the doorway, her body still thin, but no longer collapsing into itself. Dust and Nova slept close together, their breathing stronger now, their small forms rising and falling with a fragile but growing rhythm. Life had taken hold, quietly but firmly. He stepped back in, gathering what little he needed. The camera, a small pack, water, no hesitation, no second guessing. The man who had come here to disappear was gone. In his place stood someone who had remembered how to move toward something instead. By mid-morning, he was already on the road. The nearest gas station sat miles away, a lone structure pressed against the edge of the desert highway, its faded sign creaking softly in the wind. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing, unless they had nowhere else to stop. The woman behind the counter noticed everything. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with sun-worn skin that spoke of years spent under the same unforgiving sky. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose, practical knot, strands escaping around her face in a way she no longer cared to fix. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who only sold fuel and coffee. They carried something else. Loss, perhaps, or the kind of memory that doesn't fade with time. Her name was Elena Reyes. When the man entered, she studied him for only a second before returning to wiping the counter. But that second had been enough. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice calm, steady, with a quiet edge beneath it. "No," he replied simply. Silence settled between them for a moment, not uncomfortable, just measured. Then he placed the camera on the counter and turned it slightly toward her. "I think you've seen something like this before." She didn't touch it immediately. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the images, the barrels, the markings, the chains. Her hand stopped mid-motion. Something in her expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition. "My brother," she said after a long pause. "He got sick 2 years ago. Fast. Too fast. Doctors said it didn't make sense." Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter. "He used to come out here. Said he found something he couldn't explain." She looked up at him then, her gaze direct, unflinching. And then he stopped talking about it. The man nodded once. No sympathy spoken. Only acknowledgement. It was enough. Before either could say more, the door opened again. A second figure stepped inside. He was a man in his early 50s, broad but slightly stooped, as if the weight he carried had settled into his posture over time. His hair was graying at the temples, cut short but uneven, and his face bore the quiet lines of someone who had seen too much and chosen to say too little. His uniform marked him as local law enforcement, though it was worn, the edges softened by years rather than care. Sheriff Daniel Reeves. His eyes moved across the room, taking in both of them, then settling briefly on the camera. "You're early, Elena," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew something had changed. "She's not the only one," the man replied. Daniel studied him carefully now, measuring more than just appearance. There was a pause, long enough to matter. Then he stepped forward. "What did you find?" The man didn't answer directly. He turned the camera screen toward him. Daniel's expression didn't shift dramatically. It rarely did. But something tightened in his jaw, something quiet, but unmistakable. "I've heard rumors," he said slowly. "People get sick. Livestock die. Water goes bad." He exhaled through his nose, a controlled release. "No one ever brings proof." "Now you have it," the man said. Another silence, this one heavier. Before it could settle too deeply, the door creaked open again. An older woman entered, her steps slow but deliberate. She was small in stature, her frame slightly bent with age, but there was nothing fragile in the way she carried herself. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her pale skin bore the fine lines of both time and grief. In her hands, she held a worn notebook, its edges softened from years of being opened and closed. Her name was Margaret Hale. She glanced at the three of them, then at the camera, and something in her eyes flickered. Not confusion, but confirmation. "My son wrote about it," she said, her voice thin but unwavering. "Said the land was wrong, that things were being buried that shouldn't be." She held up the notebook slightly. "He tried to show people." Her grip tightened. They said he was mistaken. The man looked at her, then at the others. "Tonight," he said. No one asked what that meant. They already understood. The desert did not forgive secrets. It only waited for someone to uncover them. Night fell without ceremony. The four of them moved together across the same path the man had taken before, but this time there was no hesitation in their steps. Elena carried a small recording device. Daniel brought his radio, though he kept it silent for now. Margaret held her notebook close, as if it were both evidence and memory in one. Ash moved beside them, not behind, not following, leading. When the warehouse came into view, the tension thickened instantly. Light still glowed faintly from within. Movement. Voices. The man signaled with a subtle motion, and they spread out just enough to gain different angles without losing sight of one another. Elena activated her recorder. Daniel lifted his radio slightly. Ready. The man raised the camera. Inside, the operation was no longer hidden. Barrels were being moved. One of the men cursed as he adjusted a leaking container, the liquid inside dark and unnatural against the concrete floor. "Dump it before sunrise," another voice snapped. "We're already behind." The camera captured everything: the voices, the faces, the proof. A sudden noise, too sharp, too close, cut through the moment. One of the workers turned. "Hey!" The tension snapped. Daniel moved first, his radio coming alive with a sharp call for backup. Elena stepped back, her grip tightening but steady. Margaret didn't move at all, her eyes fixed on the scene as if watching something she had waited years to see. The man didn't run. He didn't need to. Within minutes, distant sirens began to rise, faint at first, then growing louder as they cut through the night. The men inside the warehouse scrambled, confusion replacing confidence. Too late. Lights flooded the area. Voices shouted commands. Boots hit the ground in rapid succession. The desert, for once, did not stay silent. It spoke, and the truth had nowhere left to hide. Spring did not arrive in the desert with flowers or sudden color, but with something quieter, something that softened the edges of a land once defined only by survival. The man stood outside the cabin in the early light, his posture no longer rigid with constant alertness, but not careless either. There was still vigilance in him, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about expecting danger at every turn. It was about choosing what to protect. The land around the cabin had begun to shift in subtle ways. The ground, once dry and unyielding, now held patches of life. Small, stubborn greens pushing through cracked soil as if answering a call no one had heard before. The air felt different too, still warm, still vast, but no longer empty. Behind him, the door creaked open. Ash stepped out first. Her transformation had not been sudden, but it was undeniable. The thin, fragile body that had once stood at the edge of death had filled out, her coat regaining its natural sheen, black and tan catching the sunlight in quiet strength. The scar around her hind leg remained, a pale band that would never disappear, but it no longer defined her movement. She walked with confidence now, each step grounded, deliberate. Dust followed, smaller but energetic, his darker coat giving him a shadow-like presence as he darted forward, pausing only to glance back, as if to make sure the world was still there behind him. Nova came last, slower, more cautious, her lighter frame still carrying traces of the weakness she had once fought through. But her eyes were clear now, curious, aware, alive. The man watched them for a moment, something unspoken settling in his expression. He had not planned for this, none of it. And yet, here it was. A second vehicle approached along the distant path, its movement steady but unthreatening. The man turned slightly, his body registering it before his mind did. Old instincts never left entirely. They simply learned when to rest. The truck came to a stop a short distance from the cabin. A woman stepped out. She was in her early 40s, tall and composed, with a presence that carried both authority and restraint. Her blonde hair was tied back in a low, practical ponytail, and her skin bore the faint marks of sun exposure, though not as deeply as those who lived here. Her eyes were sharp, observant, but not cold. They belonged to someone who had spent years studying both people and patterns, and learning that truth often lived somewhere between the two. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Hart. She adjusted the strap of a worn leather bag over her shoulder as she approached, her gaze moving briefly to the dogs before settling on the man. "I've read the reports," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who trusted facts more than assumptions. "And I've seen the footage you provided." He nodded once. Behind her, another man remained near the truck, speaking briefly into a radio before stepping back. He was younger, likely early 30s, lean with a controlled posture, his dark hair cut short, his expression focused but less guarded than the older sheriff. A federal agent, temporary, necessary. Dr. Hart stepped closer to Ash, stopping just outside her immediate space. She crouched slightly, not reaching out, but observing. "She's stronger than I expected," she said almost to herself, "given what she's been through." Ash watched her, ears forward but relaxed. There was no fear now, only assessment. "The contamination site is being cleared," Dr. Hart continued, standing again. "State and federal teams are working together. It'll take time. But it's contained." The man exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried since that first night loosening just enough to notice. "And the others?" he asked. "Identified," she replied. "Arrested. Charges are extensive." There was no satisfaction in her tone, only closure. Behind them, Dust chased a small swirl of sand, his movements clumsy, but joyful. Nova remained closer to the cabin, watching everything with quiet attention. Ash stood between them, her presence steady, protective, but no longer desperate. Dr. Hart followed the movement of the puppies with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You planning to keep them?" she asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out across the land. The same horizon that had once felt like an escape now felt like something else entirely. "I didn't come here to stay," he said after a moment. "And now?" He glanced back at the cabin, at the dogs, at the space that had changed without asking his permission. "Now I'm not leaving." Dr. Hart nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Over the following weeks, the cabin transformed, not dramatically, not all at once, but piece by piece. A fenced area was built, simple but sturdy. A shaded structure followed, offering protection from the harsh midday sun. Supplies began to arrive, some from official channels, others from people who had heard the story and chosen, quietly, to help. The man worked without needing to be asked, each movement purposeful, each addition to the land a reflection of something he was building not just outside, but within himself. Ash adapted quickly. She moved through the space with calm authority, her presence grounding everything around her. Dust grew faster than expected, his energy filling every corner of the enclosure, his curiosity endless. Nova remained more reserved, but her strength returned steadily, her trust deepening not through excitement, but through consistency. People began to visit, not many at first, a few, then more. Animals came with them, some injured, some abandoned, all carrying stories that echoed in different ways. The man never turned them away. He didn't call it a rescue center. He didn't give it a name, but it became one anyway. And in the quiet moments, those rare stretches when the wind softened and the world seemed to pause, he would stand at the edge of the land, looking out across the desert, not searching, not running, remembering. The scars remained, in him, in Ash, in the land itself, but they no longer marked endings. They marked survival, and in that, something else had taken root. Not loud, not obvious, but real. The kind of life that doesn't arrive all at once. The kind that returns. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or blazing light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a broken animal that refuses to give up, and a weary soul who chooses not to walk away. In a world that often looks the other way, God still works through small human decisions. The moment someone kneels instead of turns, listens instead of ignores, stays instead of leaves. Maybe that's the miracle we forget, that God places us exactly where we are needed, even when we think we are lost. And in choosing compassion, we don't just save others, we are gently saved too. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in goodness. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your home, and bring peace to your heart.